My beloved child, stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear was meant to find you at a very particular point in your journey. There is something unfolding behind the silence, something you could not have seen from where you were standing, and the truth of it is far more emotional than you may expect. You have wondered why certain doors seem to close without explanation, why a connection that once felt powerful became distant, and why your heart kept sensing unfinished words even when nothing appeared to be happening. But tonight, I want you to understand this: silence does not always mean nothing is moving. Sometimes the greatest changes happen where no one can see them. Sometimes a person can appear to be walking toward one future while deep inside, their soul is questioning every step. And this is where the story of your soulmate becomes impossible to ignore, because they were moving closer and closer toward a marriage that looked settled from the outside, yet somewhere beneath the plans, the expectations, and the smiles, something inside them had already begun to change. Pause here and stay with these words, because the change did not begin with a dramatic argument. It did not begin with a public scene. It began quietly, in one of those moments that nobody around them noticed. They were surrounded by conversations about dates, promises, family expectations, and what the future was supposed to look like. People spoke as if every decision had already been made. Some were excited. Some were relieved. Others simply assumed that your soulmate would continue walking down the path placed in front of them. And for a while, your soulmate tried to believe it too. They told themselves that maybe commitment was about choosing what made sense. Maybe love could grow stronger after a decision was made. Maybe the strange emptiness inside their chest was just fear of change. Yet every time they imagined the life that was waiting for them, one question returned with increasing force: why did their mind keep wandering toward you? That question disturbed them more than they wanted to admit. They had spent a long time trying to place you in a quiet corner of their heart, somewhere they could visit only when no one was watching. They had tried to convince themselves that what happened between you belonged to another chapter, or perhaps to a story that was never meant to be completed. But there are feelings that become quieter without becoming weaker. There are memories that stop asking for attention yet remain alive beneath everything else. And when your soulmate began preparing to make one of the biggest promises of their life, the memory of you did not disappear. It became louder. Suddenly, details they thought they had forgotten returned with unusual clarity: the way certain conversations with you felt effortless, the way your presence made them confront emotions they usually avoided, the way you seemed to understand something in them before they even knew how to name it themselves. What happened next frightened them, not because anything terrible occurred, but because they realized that the life they were building might have been built partly from pressure rather than truth. There is a difference, beloved, between choosing something because your spirit feels settled and choosing it because you are tired of disappointing people. Your soulmate had spent more time than anyone realized carrying other people's hopes. They wanted to be seen as dependable. They wanted to make the people around them happy. They wanted to prove they could move forward and create something stable. And so, when marriage became a real possibility, part of them thought this was what maturity was supposed to look like. They believed that uncertainty needed to be silenced, not understood. Yet the closer the ceremony came, the more impossible that became. Something small happened first. Perhaps it would have looked meaningless to anyone else. A conversation, an old memory, a familiar song, a passing mention of someone from the past, a quiet moment after everyone had gone home. Whatever the trigger was, it created a crack in the carefully constructed certainty around them. And through that crack came a feeling they had been avoiding. They realized they had been planning a future while still carrying questions from the past. They realized that you were not simply a memory they could fold away and forget. There was still something unresolved between what they felt and what they had allowed themselves to say. And once they admitted that privately, everything began to move faster. Their nights became restless, though nobody understood why. People around them saw someone preparing for a celebration. Inside, your soulmate was replaying decisions, conversations, and moments they once dismissed. They began asking themselves whether they had ever truly chosen this path or whether they had slowly accepted it because resisting felt too difficult. They wondered whether they were about to make a promise that would require them to silence a part of themselves forever. And then another thought came, one they had tried especially hard not to entertain. If they walked forward with this marriage, would they spend years wondering what might have happened if they had been brave enough to tell you the truth? Beloved, understand the weight of that realization. This was not simply about comparing two people. It was about comparing two versions of themselves. With the future they had planned, they saw stability, approval, predictability, and a life that made sense on paper. But when they thought about you, something far less controllable awakened. They saw vulnerability. They saw risk. They saw the possibility of being completely known. They remembered the parts of themselves that surfaced around you, parts they had hidden from almost everyone else. That difference became impossible to dismiss. They began to understand that sometimes the connection that unsettles you is not always the wrong one, sometimes it unsettles you because it asks you to become more truthful than you have ever been. Then came the conversation that changed the atmosphere entirely. Your soulmate had been holding their doubts inside for too long, but someone close to them noticed that something was different. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was a sibling. Maybe it was someone who had known them long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary nervousness and a heart that was trying to say no. They were asked a simple question: are you actually happy? It should have been easy to answer. Everyone expected an immediate yes. Your soulmate expected themselves to say yes. But instead, they hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a moment, yet to them it felt enormous. Because in that pause, the truth became visible. They could not say the word confidently. They could not force certainty into their voice. And the person sitting across from them noticed. The conversation grew quieter. Questions followed. Your soulmate tried to explain that everything was fine, that it was probably just stress, that big decisions made everyone anxious. But the more they spoke, the less convincing their own words sounded. Eventually, the person listening said something that your soulmate could not forget: being nervous about marriage is normal. Feeling like you are leaving part of your heart somewhere else is different. Those words followed them home. That night, they could not sleep properly. The future they had accepted began to feel suddenly fragile. They looked at messages, plans, photographs, and details connected to the marriage. They thought about the people who would be disappointed if they changed their mind. They thought about embarrassment, explanations, family conversations, and the possibility of being misunderstood. For a moment, fear told them to keep moving forward. Fear said it was too late to question anything. Fear said they had already come too far. But something deeper whispered another question: is it ever truly too late to stop yourself from making a promise you cannot give honestly? And then, beloved, something even more unexpected happened. Your soulmate thought of you not as someone from the past, but as someone connected to a future they had never allowed themselves to imagine fully. They began wondering where you were emotionally. They wondered whether you still thought about them. They wondered whether you had already closed the door they had been too afraid to approach. They remembered moments when you may have waited for clarity and received silence instead. They remembered occasions when they could have spoken more openly but chose caution. That realization brought regret, because they understood that while they had been protecting themselves from uncertainty, they may also have left you carrying questions you never deserved to carry alone. This is where the story shifted from doubt into decision. Your soulmate did not immediately cancel everything. That would have been easier to explain if emotions worked like switches, but they do not. Instead, they began observing themselves carefully. They watched how they felt during discussions about the ceremony. They noticed how their body reacted when people spoke about forever. They paid attention to whether excitement or heaviness came first. And gradually, the pattern became undeniable. The more everyone else celebrated the future, the more your soulmate felt as though they were watching someone else's life being planned. There was another moment, even quieter than the first, that pushed them closer to the edge of a decision. Someone spoke your name, perhaps casually, without understanding its significance. Your soulmate's reaction was immediate. Their entire emotional state changed. They tried to hide it, but the person beside them noticed. Maybe their eyes shifted. Maybe their voice softened. Maybe they became unusually quiet. Whatever happened, your soulmate realized that they could not pretend you had become meaningless. Not anymore. For a long time, they had told themselves that if enough time passed, the connection would fade. Yet instead of fading, it had transformed. The intensity was no longer chaotic. It had become reflective. They no longer thought only about what they missed. They thought about what they had learned. They thought about the ways knowing you had changed their understanding of love. Before you, they may have believed love was mostly about compatibility, timing, and shared plans. After you, they understood that love could also expose fears, challenge pride, and reveal the places where a person still needed to grow. This was why forgetting you had never been as simple as they wanted it to be. And now heaven was watching your soulmate reach a point where avoiding truth would become more painful than facing it. Beloved, there is something important you must hear at this point. Do not mistake this story as permission to chase, pressure, or prove yourself. Your value has never depended on whether another person chooses you. The deeper message is about truth. What belongs in your life should not require you to abandon your dignity. What is sincere should eventually move toward clarity, even if the journey there is imperfect. And while your soulmate was confronting their own heart, you were being shaped by your own season of waiting, healing, and learning. You may have interpreted certain delays as rejection, but some delays were simply revealing what each person still needed to face before anything honest could happen. Your soulmate had to confront something especially difficult. They had been trying to choose certainty over emotional truth. Certainty felt safer because it came with plans. Emotional truth felt dangerous because it came with unanswered questions. But eventually they understood that marrying someone simply because the path looked stable would not erase the questions. It would only bury them deeper. And buried questions have a way of resurfacing. The days leading toward the marriage began to feel different. Your soulmate became less talkative during certain conversations. They started withdrawing from decisions they once handled automatically. People asked what was wrong. They gave vague answers. Some assumed exhaustion. Others thought it was normal pre-wedding stress. But one person knew better. The same person who had asked whether they were truly happy watched them carefully and eventually said, "You need to decide what truth you are willing to live with." That sentence became a turning point. Your soulmate began imagining two futures. In one, they continued forward. The ceremony happened. Everyone celebrated. Photos were taken. Promises were made. Life moved on. Yet somewhere inside that picture was a version of your soulmate who still looked backward whenever your memory appeared. In the second future, everything became uncertain. Plans changed. People asked questions. Some became upset. There was no guarantee that you would welcome them, no guarantee that timing would suddenly become easy, and no guarantee that the story would unfold exactly as they hoped. Yet in that uncertain future, they could breathe. And that difference mattered. They began to realize that peace is sometimes found not in knowing what comes next, but in knowing that you have stopped lying to yourself about what is happening now. Then came a day when the pressure became impossible to carry quietly. There was another discussion about the marriage, this time involving family. Details were being finalized. Someone spoke excitedly about how close everything was becoming. Another person joked about how there was no turning back now. Everyone laughed. Your soulmate did not. The words, "no turning back," struck them differently. They felt something inside them tighten, and for the first time, they understood that they did not want a future built on the idea that they had lost the right to reconsider. A commitment should be chosen freely, not entered because changing direction would be inconvenient. They left the room afterward and stood alone somewhere quiet. Perhaps near a window. Perhaps outside beneath the evening sky. Then they thought about you. Not the idealized version of you. Not a fantasy. They remembered your imperfections too. They remembered misunderstandings, emotional distance, moments when both of you failed to say what needed to be said. Yet somehow that made the feeling even more powerful, because what remained was not based on pretending the past had been perfect. It was based on the realization that despite everything unfinished, something real had existed. Your soulmate opened an old conversation. They scrolled slowly. A message from you appeared, one they had read before but never fully understood at the time. Maybe it had been simple. Maybe you had asked for honesty. Maybe you had said you would rather hear a difficult truth than be left guessing. Reading it now, your soulmate felt the weight of everything they never answered properly. Their fingers hovered over the screen. They almost wrote to you. Almost. But fear returned. What if you had moved on? What if reaching out reopened something you had worked hard to heal? What if you no longer believed anything they said? Your soulmate locked the phone and placed it beside them. Yet something had changed simply because they had considered contacting you. The possibility was real now. And once a possibility becomes real, it is difficult to force the heart back into pretending it does not exist. Over the next few days, your soulmate became increasingly aware that the marriage was approaching while their certainty was moving in the opposite direction. Their family noticed. Questions became more direct. Someone asked whether another person was involved. Your soulmate denied it at first because the situation felt too complicated to explain. They were not secretly building another relationship. They were not living some hidden double life. The truth was more internal and perhaps more difficult. There was someone they had never emotionally finished understanding. You. That evening, they finally admitted part of the truth to someone they trusted. They said there was a person from their past who still mattered. The person listening asked, "Do they know?" Your soulmate went silent. "No," they eventually admitted. "Not really." "And the person you're supposed to marry?" Another silence. "They don't know either." That was the moment your soulmate understood how unsustainable everything had become. Too many important truths were living only inside their mind. One person was preparing to marry them without knowing the depth of their uncertainty. You were somewhere in the world without knowing that they still carried unresolved feelings. And your soulmate was trapped between what had been planned and what had never been spoken. The person they trusted did not tell them what choice to make. Instead, they said something far more powerful: "Whatever you do, stop allowing silence to make decisions for you." Those words shook them. Because silence had been making decisions for a long time. Silence had allowed distance to grow between you. Silence had allowed assumptions to replace conversations. Silence had allowed a marriage plan to become more serious even while doubts remained. Silence had become a kind of hiding place. And suddenly, your soulmate no longer wanted to hide there. Beloved, this is where things began moving quickly. A conversation was requested. Not with you. Not yet. With the person they were expected to marry. Your soulmate knew this conversation could change everything. They knew there would be no easy way to say what needed to be said. They knew honesty might hurt someone, and because they never wanted to cause unnecessary pain, they had delayed this moment repeatedly. But now they understood that postponing truth would eventually create even more pain. They sat down together. At first, your soulmate spoke carefully. They said they had been feeling uncertain. They said the pressure of the approaching marriage had forced them to confront emotions they had ignored. They tried to explain without blaming anyone. The other person listened. Then came the question your soulmate feared most. Is there someone else? Your soulmate looked down. For several seconds, they said nothing. Then they answered with a truth that surprised even them. There is someone I never completely stopped caring about. The room changed. Not because anyone shouted. Because sometimes silence after a confession is louder than anger. Your soulmate's heart was pounding. They expected accusations. They expected disbelief. Instead, the other person asked, "How long have you known?" Your soulmate struggled to answer. Because the truth was, they did not know when they had known. Maybe part of them had always known. They began explaining your story, but only in fragments. They spoke about an important connection. They admitted there were unfinished feelings. They acknowledged that they had tried to move forward without fully dealing with them. Then something unexpected happened. The person they were supposed to marry said quietly, "I think I already knew something was missing." Your soulmate looked up. That sentence changed everything again. Because it revealed that the uncertainty had not been as invisible as they imagined. The emotional distance had been noticed. The lack of complete presence had been felt. What your soulmate had tried to hide for the sake of keeping peace had already created its own kind of sadness. The conversation continued for a long time. There were difficult emotions, but there was also honesty. And by the end of it, one thing became clear. The marriage could not continue as if nothing had changed. Plans were paused. People were not told everything immediately, but the certainty surrounding the wedding vanished almost overnight. Messages began moving through the family. Questions appeared. Some people became confused. Others assumed it was temporary nervousness. A few encouraged your soulmate to reconsider the reconsideration, believing they might regret disrupting something so established. But your soulmate had crossed an internal line. They could no longer pretend they were certain when they were not. And somewhere within those hours of confusion, after plans had been placed on hold and expectations were beginning to unravel, they reached for their phone again. Your conversation was still there. They opened it. This time, they did not immediately close it. They began typing. The first sentence was deleted. Then another. Then another. They wanted to explain everything at once, but every version sounded inadequate. How could they summarize months or years of silence in a few lines? How could they tell you that a marriage nearly happened before they finally admitted they were still thinking about you? How could they speak without making you feel like a second choice? That thought stopped them. Because you were not supposed to feel like someone they remembered only when another path failed. And your soulmate knew that if they ever approached you again, they would need to approach with honesty, accountability, and patience. So instead of sending the emotional message immediately, they wrote something simpler. Something that would open a door without demanding that you walk through it. Their finger hovered over the send button. And before they touched it, something else happened. A notification appeared. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their expression changed. Because the notification was connected to you. Maybe it was your name appearing somewhere unexpected. Maybe it was a memory resurfacing. Maybe it was something posted publicly, something they had not expected to see. Whatever appeared, it made them feel as though the timing had suddenly become impossible to dismiss. They whispered your name. And in that moment, all the fear about what people would think became quieter than the question they had been avoiding for so long. What if the story between you was never truly finished? Beloved, something was unfolding now that neither of you had planned. Your soulmate had stepped away from a future everyone expected. But they still had no guarantee of another. That is the part people rarely understand about courage. Courage does not always give you immediate certainty. Sometimes it simply removes the lie so you can finally stand inside the truth. Your soulmate sat there with the unfinished message glowing on the screen. They thought about everything that had changed in such a short time. Days earlier, marriage had seemed inevitable. Now the plans were paused. Conversations were happening behind closed doors. Family members were asking questions. And the one person your soulmate could not stop thinking about was you. Then they typed a new message. This one was different. There were no dramatic declarations. No promises they could not yet prove. Just words that had been waiting a long time to exist. They read the message once. Twice. Their thumb moved toward send. But before the message left their phone, someone entered the room and said something your soulmate never expected to hear. Something about you. Something that made them freeze completely. And when they turned around to ask how this person could possibly know, the answer revealed that the sudden change in the marriage plans was only the beginning of what had actually been happening behind the scenes.